The Goldenrod Protocols by James Oliver, copyright 2023.
Personally, Jeff, I think they're traumatized, all of them. She gestured with her left hand so her red bracelet caught Jack's attention. Trauma's part of life where they're from, but they can't face their demons and they're full of hatred. So instead of working with us to make the world a better place, they want to destroy it. Here we go again, Jack thought. She was talking about them. Allegiance, the enemy. The people who lived on the opposite, the provinces surrounding the Commonwealth metro states. Jack had heard many stories of the twisted ways of their backward world. Chaos was their end and violence was their means. Everyone had their theories about why, and this was hers. At least, she seemed to think it was. Public discourse was a piercing, empty reverberation of echoes from the mouths of people like her. Adults with minds like children, vulnerable to the unscrupulous who painted the world around their minds to fill the voids within them. Personally, she said, convinced it was her own idea, proud of herself for connecting dots so subtle only she could see them. But she'd said nothing insightful. The devoted party often touted social trauma on the opposite as the Great Republic's biggest challenge. He slid his left hand into his lap, carefully. Sudden movements were sometimes mistaken for threats. No one was dumb enough not to wear the red bracelet anymore, but it was still a good idea to keep it visible. "You're so right," Jack assured her, hoping she'd leave him alone. But she didn't, and he was terrified of challenging her. For now, she was his master. She looks like a Patricia. Patricia was a bit heavy-set. Her stylist knew how to make her brown hair look trendy without taking a big risk, but her eyes weren't glazed enough for someone under 45. She wore a flowing beige blouse with gray slacks. Her only standouts were an obnoxious necklace and a bright green belt. Standing out was crucial to fitting in, but she missed the mark. Too self-conscious, he guessed. She looked like someone you'd see in a restaurant with several friends just like her, each belting a short, high-pitched cackle every few seconds, like the shrill, obnoxious mating call of an exotic bird. Jack spent so much of his day wondering who was watching and what wrong move might condemn him. He needed this time alone with his guard down, listening to the engine's soothing hum while the landscape glided by below. But Patricia had stolen it. She boarded the shuttle a few stops after his, and even though most of the seats were empty, she sat right across the aisle from him. "I don't understand it, Jeff," she declared. "I don't know what the devoted have to do to get through to them. They just don't know what's good for them, if you ask me." "I didn't ask you." Jack squirmed under his skin. Patricia's eyes fixed on his like snipers, freezing him in place until she decided this was over. He searched for an escape whenever she broke her gaze to find her next words, but his eyes snapped right back to hers once she found them. But he couldn't tune her out. He had to listen so he could respond. She had hijacked his mind. "Not that they care," she continued. "Like I said, they're just broken people, not even people, really. And they want everyone to suffer as much as they do. They're hateful and sadistic." People like Patricia often made such proclamations as if they were obvious. Jack was expected to affirm them, even though they never seemed so obvious to him. How could anyone know what it's like in the provinces? But he'd learned not to question anyone out loud. His curiosity wasn't worth the risk. "Maybe if I'm really careful." "That's such an interesting perspective," he offered, meticulously planning his next words. He understood this language, but he wasn't fluent. "How did you figure that out?" She'd likely seen dozens, maybe hundreds of people make this point on Town Square. None had ever been asked to explain, and had all received high praise. She no doubt expected the same affirmation, but he could see in her shaken expression that he hadn't given it to her. Shit. "Well, it's a fact," she insisted. "How else do you explain it?" Moisture started to cover his forehead. He wasn't sure what she meant, but didn't dare ask. "Of course, you're so right," he conceded, trying to stay calm. "I guess I just never thought of it that way." Patricia glared at him through her wincing eyes. "But," he quickly added, "it makes a lot of sense. I'm actually embarrassed I never considered it." Metro states in other parts of the Great Republic had fought allegiant insurgents near their borders, and Jack knew how lucky he was that it hadn't happened here. He knew they fired the first shots in the war that became the reckoning. He knew allegiant politicians wielded iron fists, forbidding dissent and demanding compliance under threat of torture and death. Right and wrong were clearly and equally defined across the Commonwealth, But there was no such objectivity in the provinces, where laws and morals were haphazard and differed from place to place. The savages made their own rules. He'd heard recordings of their war cries that sent chills down to his bone marrow. Many in the metrostate believed allegiance walked among them, but he'd never met one. Most people hadn't. Patricia probably hadn't either. Even in companies like Jack's with distribution centers in a province, great care was taken only to hire the 10% or so of allegiance with the capacity for civility. Even then, Jack had long heard that only a few specially trained corporate employees were allowed to contact them. Neither he nor Patricia nor anyone else had the first clue why allegiance were the way they were. As far as he was concerned, discussing it was a waste of time. But as long as they existed, no one was safe. The threat was all-consuming and ever-present. She had to think about them. She had to talk about them. She had to do her part. The danger was too pressing to ignore. What a happy coincidence that she'd also earned social points by repeating these things to everyone she met. Typical Czech. Jack sometimes heard the progs who worked at his factory use that word, Czech, when they didn't know he was eavesdropping. He wasn't sure what it meant, but it sounded like they were talking about people like Patricia, prigs with puckered assholes who competed to outconform, constantly checking themselves and each other for signs of undevotion. Czechs were peacocks with bright, flashy tales of unity and uniformity. They were the true believers, always accepting, never questioning, always scolding. Full conformity to the strictest standards of devotion, so much so that it defined their very essence. Progs were suspect and allegiance were outsiders, but Czechs checked out. Czechs checked every box on the checklist. They were golden boys and girls, shiny and pure. Jack always felt crushing pressure to be Czech's version of perfect when they were around.